Imagine waking up in a country that felt like the future. Cars in every driveway, radios in every parlor, skyscrapers punching the skyline, and a stock market that seemed to grow for no reason other than that it had always grown. Now imagine going to bed during the same week and finding that paper fortune gone. Not because some war destroyed factories or a sudden natural disaster leveled cities, but because a chain of mistaken bets, fragile banks, environmental collapse and policy failures turned optimism into catastrophe. That, in a sentence, is the snapshot we're aiming for. A simple explanation of the Great Depression that connects the flashy headlines to the human stories behind them. We'll move fast but clearly. First the boom of the 1920s, then the mechanics that turned prosperity into a bubble. The moment, Black Tuesday. When the bubble burst, how that shock spread through banks and across oceans, the real human suffering that followed, including the Dust Bowl, and finally the political response and slow, messy recovery that reshaped American institutions. Stick around if you want a clean, no-nonsense map of how all these pieces fit together. The Roaring Twenties felt like a technological miracle show. Factories were humming in new ways. Assembly lines cut the time and cost to build cars and household goods, so things that had once been luxuries became common. People began to buy things not only with cash, but with promises to pay later, installment plans, which turned a one-time purchase into a stream of future payments. Radios brought the same songs and ads into homes across the nation. Advertising, credit, and mass production created a feedback loop. More goods, more ads, more buying, more factories. But beneath the glitter, there was a split. Cities and industries were booming, but farmers faced low prices and heavy debt. The productivity gains that made cars cheap didn't lift crop prices. Agricultural incomes lagged behind urban prosperity. So Americans experienced a double reality. A confident, consumer-driven metropolitan life on one hand, and struggling rural communities on the other. That contrast mattered because it meant the economy's strength was uneven and vulnerable in places people didn't often look. What made the 1920s feel truly new, though, was finance. Ordinary people started treating the stock market like a place for easy profit. Banks and brokers invented ways to let people buy stocks with only a small down payment. Margin buying. In plain terms, margin meant you could buy $100 worth of stock with, say, $10 of your own money and borrow the rest. If the stock went up, your small investment magnified into a big gain. If it went down, however, you still owed the loan, and brokers could demand more money on short notice in what were called margin calls. Suddenly, the market wasn't just investors gambling their savings, it was a lever amplifying gains and losses across a large number of people. That leverage was paired with corporate structures that hid risks. Some large companies were controlled by layers of smaller firms and holding companies, so that the health of one business depended on a chain of others. And as more people piled into stocks, social proof kicked in. If your barber, your cousin, or the bellhop had a hot tip, you felt like you were missing out if you didn't play along. Optimism drowned out caution. Economists and a few commentators warned that prices were getting disconnected from the underlying value of companies. But warnings were easy to ignore in an era of upbeat ads and daily headlines about new record highs. Then came October 1929. The collapse didn't happen in a single cinematic moment of doom. It unfolded across a few frantic days. But October 29th, Black Tuesday, became the symbol. Traders watched the ticker tape race and then jam. Investors who had bought on margin began to get margin calls. Brokers demanded immediate payment to cover loans. When many couldn't pay, they were forced to sell, dragging prices down further. In the panic, paper wealth evaporated at a staggering pace. One commonly cited figure from that week is roughly $14 billion of market value lost in the immediate crash, a number that sounded almost unimaginable at the time, and, adjusted, appears even larger today, about $200 billion in some modern comparisons. That's a useful reminder. The crash wasn't just a headline. It wiped out fortunes that people had counted on for retirement, business expansion, or simple financial security. But the stock market itself was only one piece. The crash triggered a cascade because banks had been entangled with the market and with the real economy. Many banks had invested depositors' money in loans to stock speculators or in corporate securities that now lost value. As stories of losses spread, depositors rushed to withdraw their money. Bank runs, long lines at teller windows and frantic phone calls could turn an insolvent bank into an empty vault overnight. When banks failed, they couldn't lend to businesses or accept deposits that people needed for payroll and daily life. Credit that had lubricated the boom froze. And because the United States was tied into a global financial system, the shock crossed borders. American banks had lent to Europe during and after World War I. When those loans were called in, or when US banks grew cautious, European governments and businesses felt the squeeze. Global trade contracted as credit lines snapped shut and nations raised barriers. The financial system's connections meant that a crisis that started in New York reverberated in Frankfurt, London, and Buenos Aires. Contagion is a medical word for a reason. Fear and constrained credit traveled fast. The result was a deep economic contraction. Factories closed or cut shifts. Orders dried up. Unemployment rose sharply, eventually reaching a peak near 25% in the United States. And those numbers represented real people losing not just paychecks, but the sense of future security. Bread lines and soup kitchens became common images of urban life. Families sold what they could, moved in together to save on rent, or faced eviction and homelessness. In cities, makeshift shantytowns known as Hoovervilles sprang up, named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for federal inaction, even as he called for voluntary cooperation and limited government measures. On the plains, a different but related disaster was unfolding. Years of intensive farming, combined with a drought in the early 1930s, left topsoil exposed. Windstorms picked up the loose dirt and created dark clouds of dust that could blot out the sun for hours or days. Crops failed. Tractors and combines couldn't fix the ecological damage quickly. Families watched harvests vanish and found themselves with little to sell and mounting debts to the banks. Many packed up and headed west to California and other states in search of work, a migration famously captured in photography and literature. Images like the portrait of a weary migrant mother came to symbolize the era's human toll. Those who stayed often faced health problems from dust inhalation and the slow collapse of rural communities. The toll of the Depression was more than economic statistics. Birth rates fell as families delayed having children. Marriage rates dipped. Suicide and despair rose in some communities. Yet the era also gave rise to acts of resilience. People formed mutual aid groups, churches expanded social services, and artists and writers turned their attention to documenting and making sense of the crisis. Radio and cinema provided an escape and, at times, a way to spread messages of hope or solidarity. But entertainment could not erase the very real suffering of unemployment and dislocation. Politically, the crisis strained faith in institutions. Hoover, who had become president at the end of the 1920s, believed in voluntary cooperation between business and government and warned against heavy-handed federal intervention. That approach felt inadequate to many Americans watching banks fail and jobs vanish. Discontent boiled over in scenes that alarmed the country. Veterans of World War I, known as the Bonus Army, marched on Washington to demand early payment of promised bonuses. They were met with eviction, and, in a shocking episode, with force that left an ugly stain on public memory. The anger and desperation of the moment opened space for more radical political voices to gain attention, though those movements never displaced mainstream politics. Enter Franklin D. Roosevelt. By the time he was inaugurated in 1933, the public mood had shifted decisively toward expecting stronger federal action. FDR's first days in office signaled a different tone and a willingness to experiment. He famously told Americans that they had nothing to fear but fear itself, a line meant to shake the nation out of paralysis and to restore confidence. What followed was a range of programs and reforms, collectively called the New Deal, that aimed both to provide immediate relief and to reshape the rules that had allowed the boom and bust. Some of the most visible programs focused on jobs and infrastructure. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, put young men to work on conservation projects. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, employed millions on public works, building roads, schools, and other civic projects. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, brought electricity and modernization to a large, underdeveloped region of the country. These programs had multiple effects. They provided incomes, created useful public goods, and perhaps most importantly during a crisis, gave a sense of purpose and dignity to people who had lost both. On the regulatory side, New Deal reforms sought to stabilize the financial system. The Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, was created to police the stock market and reduce fraud and excess speculation. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, was established to insure bank deposits so that depositors would no longer face the same terrifying choice between losing everything or clinging to a failing bank. Social Security introduced the idea of a federal safety net for the elderly and those unable to work. These institutions did not end hardship overnight, and they certainly didn't fix every structural problem, but they changed the rules of the game and reduced certain types of risk that had been starkly evident during the crisis. It's important to say plainly, the New Deal did not magically end the Depression. Recovery was gradual and uneven. Unemployment fell in fits and starts, and some regions and industries recovered faster than others. The economy's return to full employment took many years and was influenced by multiple factors beyond federal programs alone. But the New Deal did leave a durable legacy, a broader expectation that the federal government had a role in stabilizing the economy, protecting citizens from total loss in banks, and investing in public goods that markets might otherwise underprovide. Culture responded as well. Artists, photographers, and writers documented the era with a clarity that later generations would use to understand it. Radio programs and films offered distraction, but also sometimes subtle commentary on social conditions. Migrant stories and images, like the photograph of that tired mother looking directly at the camera, cut through abstractions and forced people to see individuals behind the numbers. If we step back and try to synthesize, the Great Depression was not caused by a single error or a single villain. It was the product of several interacting failures. One was excessive financial leverage and speculative behavior in the stock market. Margin buying and opaque corporate ties turned a correction into a crash. Another was banking fragility. Many banks were small, poorly capitalized, or exposed to the same risks as their depositors. A third was agricultural distress and environmental mismanagement, which made rural areas vulnerable to drought and dust storms. A fourth was policy choices, both pre- and post-crash, that sometimes amplified problems, whether through inadequate regulation, international financial policies that transmitted shocks abroad, or delayed federal relief. Each element fed the others. Optimism made people take risks. Risk-taking concentrated exposure in institutions that then failed and transmitted pain across the economy. So what lessons did the crisis leave? First, systems that look strong in good times can be fragile in the face of shocks, especially when they rely on leverage and short-term confidence. Second, safety nets and institutions that limit contagious runs, like deposit insurance and market oversight, can reduce the chance that financial panics turn into prolonged social disasters. Third, economic pain is not just about numbers. It reshapes families, migration, politics, and culture in ways that last for generations. Finally, crises force choices. Either allow suffering to run wild or use collective action to limit damage and rebuild. The New Deal represented a choice to act, imperfectly, experimentally, but decisively, and those choices left enduring institutions. We should also be careful about analogies. The 1920s and 1930s had technological and social features specific to their era. Comparing them directly to one modern event without context can mislead. What does travel forward from this history is more general. How confidence, credit, fragile institutions and environmental conditions can combine to produce catastrophe, and how political will and policy design can alter the path back from collapse. The human images repeat. A trader clutching a newspaper as the tape rolls slow, families in lines waiting for soup, a migrant mother with worry in her eyes, young men building a bridge or planting trees under a government program that pays a modest wage but restores hope. Those are not just photographs for nostalgia, they're evidence of what economic collapse feels like up close. They remind us that behind every percentage point of unemployment, there are people rearranging lives. To close the circle with the image we started with, waking up in abundance and going to bed facing ruin wasn't a magical reversal. It was the natural result of a system that had grown complex and confident without sufficient checks, of environmental misuse that lay waiting to be triggered, and of policy choices that at times came too slowly. Recovery took leadership, institutional reform, and cultural resilience, and it unfolded slowly. The institutions born out of that struggle, the FDIC, the SEC, the various work programs, and Social Security, changed how Americans think about risk, markets, and government responsibility. If this plain map helped you see how all these pieces fit together, there are more resources linked in the description, a simple timeline, primary sources, and a short reading list to dive deeper. If you like this breakdown and want more explainers that connect the headlines to the human stories, consider subscribing and checking those links. The Great Depression is a hard story, but its lessons about humility, regulation, and collective response are painfully useful, and they're reasons to pay attention before optimism becomes fragility.